910 Big 550 KTRS. We are now officially joined by KPLR Channel 11.2. So the radio show is now airing on 11.2. And so those people who are watching on TV, you are watching a live radio broadcast on the Big 550 KTRS. You can certainly watch us on TV. You can listen to us on the radio. You can download the app and listen to us free on your phone. You can watch us at stltoday.com, the opinion tab, and you can certainly watch us at KTRS.com for the hour, 5 days a week here on the Big 550 KTRS and KPLR 11.2. Jonathan Horn joins us. In his past life, he's a Yale graduate as well as a speechwriter for George W. Bush, and he has appeared on MSNBC as well as the BBC Radio, as well as all other outlets. He has written a book called The Man Who Would Not Be Washington. Jonathan Horn, welcome to KTRS and welcome to St. Louis.
Thanks for having me.
The book is about Robert E. Lee's Civil War and his decision that changed American history. First, let's start with Robert E. Lee. I had no idea that he was married to somebody who was related to George Washington.
That's right. I think most people don't realize that Robert E. Lee had these very strong connections to George Washington. Of course, Robert E. Lee's father was a man named Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee, who was George Washington's most famous eulogist, the man who had written the words "first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen," which, of course, are still the words that we remember George Washington by today. And then Robert E. Lee, as you mentioned, had married the daughter of George Washington's adopted son. And these connections were seen as extremely influential on the eve of the Civil War, so much so that leaders on both sides of the conflict actually saw great significance to them and actually wanted Lee's service for high command.
So Robert E. Lee, who spent some time here in St. Louis, is that where he got his love of his country from, sort of lineage from George Washington? I
think that's right, and of course he did work in St. Louis. He was an engineer, and he had served for more than 3 decades in the U.S. Army by the time the Civil War had come. And yes, he had such strong connections to the country, and he actually, on the eve of the Civil War, as this debate is happening about what will happen after Abraham Lincoln has been elected, he's looking at the original sources and deciding that he thinks that George Washington actually would have opposed secession, which is a fascinating thing to think about, and he himself actually personally opposes secession, but at the same time he makes this decision that he cannot go against his home state of Virginia.
All right, Jonathan Horn, how did you become so interested in Robert E. Lee, and why did you want to spend time writing this book?
Well, actually, it's just a question of geography. I grew up on the Potomac River, and that's the river that Robert E. Lee grew up on. He was born downriver from Washington in a place called Westmoreland County, Virginia. He grew up in Alexandria, which is just downriver from Washington, and of course he fought some of his most famous battles right along the Potomac. So this history has always been around me, and I've always been fascinated by this decision that he had to make at the start of the war, this sort of irreversible choice. There was no going back for Lee.
Right. So now, was he given and offered by Lincoln the full Union Army, or was he given and offered a command of some part of the Union Army?
And that's a good distinction you just made, because so often we make that mistake. And what happened was an emissary for Abraham Lincoln called Lee to Washington. This is in April 1861. And offered him command of the main Union Army that was being raised to crush secession. So an equivalent that was not yet known as this, but it would eventually become what we think of today as the Army of the Potomac, which is, of course, was the main Union Army in the eastern theater of the war. But Lee actually immediately turns down the offer, and actually Lincoln's emissary appeals to Lee and says that the country looks to him as the representative of the Washington family. But Lee turns it down, and then his mentor in the military, who was another Virginian, who was actually the ranking general in the Union Army at that time, but he's too old to take command, says, "Lee, you have made the greatest mistake of your life, but I feared it would be so."
Was it a mistake?
Well, if you look at the history, as it turns out, I mean, that's sort of what the question of the book is all about. The decision that Lee makes very much destroys his bonds to Washington in very personal ways. I think that will shock people. Some people already know something about how Lee was living at Arlington House before the Civil War. And what people don't realize, though, is that Arlington House was filled with relics of George Washington because it had been built by Robert E. Lee's father-in-law, who, as I mentioned, was George Washington's adopted son. But one of the very first things that happens when Lee makes his decision to side with Virginia is that Union soldiers cross the Potomac River, climb the Arlington Heights, and seize that high ground. Because if you've ever been to Washington, you can't let the enemy have that high ground above Washington. And of course, eventually, Arlington will become a cemetery.
That is really interesting that Robert E. Lee was against secession and yet ultimately chose the South. Now, was that because he was a Southerner? He was from Virginia? What was was that as simple what it was? He had his love of his state more than the love of his country?
He said to everybody that he'd always been taught that his first loyalty was due to his state. And that surprised some people because in George Washington's farewell address, he had said, put the title of American before any local allegiance. But Lee had said that he had always been taught that Virginia was first, and so he had this devotion to the Union, but he felt the duty to follow his native state of Virginia. So actually, just 3 days after he resigns his commission in the Union Army, in what his wife would describe that decision to resign as the severest struggle of his life. Just 3 days after that, Lee goes to Richmond and accepts command of Virginia's armed forces.
The book is called The Man Who Would Not Be Washington, Robert E. Lee's Civil War and His Decision That Changed American History. Jonathan Horn, our guest, former speechwriter to George W. Bush. So, Robert E. Was it known that he was just never going to take the Union appointment, or was there some question?
It certainly was not known to everybody what would happen. As I said, otherwise the emissary for Abraham Lincoln would have never called him across the Potomac to Washington for that meeting. Lee's mentor in the military, as I mentioned, who was a man named Winfield Scott, who was also a Virginian, who ultimately decides to stay with the Union despite being a Virginian, is worried about what Lee will do, and he does tell him, as I said, that he feared he would make this decision.
Was Robert E. Lee sick most of the time during the Civil War? He was in failing health, wasn't he?
Well, what happened to Lee, and actually we tend to have this image of Lee as being this very gray-bearded man or white-bearded man, depending on the picture you look at, during the Civil War. But he started the war not looking that young. He had very little gray hair when the war first began. It's not until after his very first campaign in Western Virginia that he comes back with the beard that we know, that we so identify with Lee today. And then he does have some sort of major health problem in the time before the Battle of Chancellorsville in 1863. And that's, there's been some debate about whether that might have even been a heart attack that Lee had. And so then, for the rest of his life, he does have health problems, and he dies 5 years after the Civil War.
So I'm sure you played this parlor game once or twice, if Robert E. Lee accepts the offer from Lincoln, how does the world look different today?
Right, and that's, of course, one of the great unknowns to history, and we can't answer it because it's counterfactual, but there is reason to think that if he had been successful, and Lee was a brilliant military officer, there was no doubting his military genius. People saw it during the Mexican-American War. Winfield Scott had said that Robert E. Lee was the finest soldier he had ever seen in the field. So if Lee had prevailed, it's not too much to think that he might have one day been president of the United States, and perhaps we would associate Robert E. Lee today as the man most closely linked to George Washington. And what significance would we derive from that if the man who had saved George Washington's Union was so closely connected to George Washington? Instead, of course, when we think about the person who saved the Union, our thoughts immediately go to Abraham Lincoln, who was born without any connection to George Washington.
And you have to think that the rebellion or the secession or whatever you want to call it wouldn't have lasted 4 bloody years. The war would have turned out very differently as well.
It is a fascinating question to think about what this military genius would have done if he was in command of the Union forces, and I do think things would have been different.
Yeah, but not only for the Union, but also for the Southern Army, right? Could somebody have stepped in and have done all the things he did with less resources and all those types of things to sort of keep the fighting going for as long as it did?
Right, and Lee really did have a talent for being able to seize the initiative and battle with forces that were always undermanned, and he had an ability to always somehow seem like he was in charge of the battle, that he was somehow on the offensive, which really was a form of genius. And he always, interesting, though, is if you look at his writing, he always thought he had no choice. The reason he had to do those things was the situation demanded it of him. And, of course, Lee was also a genius on the defensive. So much of what we think about trench warfare started during the Civil War, and Lee had his men digging.
It also goes to show you, we talked about this a while ago with the latest Robert E. Lee. It seems like there's a reinvestigation of Robert E. Lee all these many years later. Would you agree with that?
I think so. I think we're constantly learning new things about him. We're finding new letters that he wrote, new papers. We're getting a better sense of who he was. So often these people in history, these important historical figures, become symbols for different causes, and we lose sight of who they actually were as people. And Lee was a fascinating person. He could be very funny. He could be very charming. He had a great sense of humor. He also had an extreme sense of frustration. He always had a sense that he couldn't have things exactly his own way.
Are there any descendants of Washington and/or Robert E. Lee that live today?
Yeah, Robert E. Lee certainly has descendants. George Washington, of course, famously had no children. But there are members of the Washington family out there, and actually during Robert E. Lee's time, there were a lot of great-grandnephews of George Washington during the Civil War, and one of them actually served as an aide to Robert E. Lee during one of his very first campaigns in Western Virginia in 1861, and that aide actually dies under Robert E. Lee's command.
So how did you go about researching the book, Jonathan Horn?
I went to the archives and looked as many Lee papers as I could, because there's no better insight into a man than to see what he's writing in his own words and his own voice. So I looked at his letters to his wife, to his children, and you really do get a sense that this was very much just a fascinating person. And one of the things, of course, about Lee's letters is that they are scattered in different archives. And the reason for that, of course, is partly because when you lose a war, your letters end up being somewhat scattered.
The book is called The Man Who Would Not Be Washington, Robert E. Lee's Civil War and His Decision That Changed American History. Jonathan Horn, our guest. And what's interesting about this is I didn't know that he was connected to Washington. I didn't know that they were trying to make him the second Washington, if you will. But then at the end, this college, Washington is Lee, is named after Robert E. Lee and George Washington. That's
exactly right. And so after the Civil War, he gets this offer from this little college in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia that's then known as Washington College, and it has a very direct connection to George Washington because George Washington had actually endowed the college very early in its history. And it's been very much destroyed during the Civil War, so it's not in good shape, but they decide to offer Lee the presidency. And most people think there's no way he'll accept this offer from this small, little, insignificant institution. This is the South's most famous citizen. But Lee actually sees it as a great opportunity, and the reason is that for 4 years he's been leading the young men of the South in war, and now he feels this obligation to go help prepare them for peace and to make them into productive citizens. And he actually spends the next 5 years of his life as the president of this college, which today has been written, as Washington and Lee University.
Jonathan Horn, our guest. The book is The Man Who Would Not Be Washington. Jonathan Horn, that's the newest book. In your past life, you were a speechwriter for George W. Bush. If Jeb asks you to be a speechwriter, would you take the job?
Oh, I don't see any offers coming my way. I'm very much right now in history. So,
all right.
But I keep following the news, of course, and I'm thinking about tonight's State of the Union address.
And thanking that and happy you're not there putting the final touches on that speech?
Very much happy. It's a tough speech to write because there's so much ground you have to cover. And so often, unfortunately, what happens with the State of the Union address is it ends up becoming just a big laundry list because you only get a sentence to spend on every single idea. Ultimately, I think the speech would probably be better if the president could say, tonight I'm just going to focus on 2 or 3 things that are very important to our country. But we have this expectation that he'll cover every single topic imaginable, and that makes it a very tough speech to write.
Yeah. Jonathan Horn, former White House presidential speechwriter and an author, historian now. His newest book, The Man Who Would Not Be Washington, Robert E. Lee's Civil War and His Decision That Changed American History. Jonathan Horn, thanks for checking in.
Thanks for having me today.
You got it. It's 9:25 here, Big 550.